The Lewis mansion was built to last forever, but at 2 o'clock in the morning it burned like dry paper. The orange glow of the fire lit up the dark sky, turning the expensive gardens into a place of nightmares. In the middle of the driveway, the tires of a pink sports car screeched against the stone. Bianca Lewis, the boss's wife, didn't look back at the black smoke rising from the windows. She didn't look back at the home she had lived in for years. She only checked her makeup in the mirror, stepped on the gas, and drove away. She wore silk pajamas that cost more than a year of rent, and her only thought was saving herself. Behind her, standing in the shadows of the servants' entrance, was Chidinma. She was a young woman with deep brown skin and eyes that had learned to see everything while staying quiet. To the people who visited the house, Chidinma was just a shadow in a light blue dress. She was the girl who cleaned the floors, folded the laundry, and disappeared when the important people entered the room. Her life was invisible. Every morning, Chidinma's day started before the sun came up. She had to make sure Bianca's coffee was exactly the right temperature and that her pink silk dresses were pressed without a single wrinkle. Bianca was beautiful, but her beauty was sharp. She was sassy and demanding, often looking at Chidinma as if she were a piece of furniture rather than a person. "Don't just stand there," Bianca would say with a roll of her eyes. "This room won't clean itself." But while Bianca was loud and selfish, there was one person in the house who truly saw Chidinma. That was Sarah, Charles's mother. Sarah was old and frail, with silver hair and hands that shook when she reached for her tea. While Bianca ignored the elderly woman, Chidinma spent her extra time making sure Sarah was comfortable. They didn't talk much, but when Chidinma tucked a blanket around Sarah's legs, the old woman would pat her hand and smile. On this terrible night, the world changed. Chidinma stood on the grass, her heart pounding against her ribs. She watched Bianca's car lights disappear into the distance. The mansion was screaming with the sound of breaking glass and falling wood. Most of the other servants had already run away in fear. Chidinma knew she should run, too. She had no money, no power, and no reason to die for a family that barely knew her name. But then, she heard it. A faint, thin cry from the second floor of the West Wing. It was Sarah. Chidinma looked at the open road, and then she looked at the roaring fire. She took a deep breath of the hot, smoky air, tied her apron tight, and ran straight into the flames. The ground shook as a second explosion ripped through the Lewis mansion. It was a sound so loud that Chidinma's ears began to ring. Glass rained down like sharp, sparkling stars, and the smell of gasoline choked the air. Chidinma crawled toward the fountain, her eyes stinging from the thick black smoke that was starting to cover the beautiful gardens. In the distance, the red taillights of the pink sports car grew smaller and smaller until they vanished. Bianca was gone. She hadn't even paused to see if anyone was still alive inside. To Bianca, Sarah was just an old woman who took up space, and Chidinma was just a girl who folded clothes. Bianca's escape felt like a final slap to the face. She had everything, the money, the jewels, and the name, but she had zero heart. Chidinma stood up, her legs shaking. The heat was so strong it felt like a heavy wall pressing against her chest. Part of her wanted to run toward the gates. She could escape into the city and never look back. She could find a life where she wasn't a shadow in someone else's house. But then, a high-pitched scream broke through the roar of the fire. "Help me! Please, someone!" It was Sarah. The old woman was trapped in the West Wing, the part of the house where the flames were the tallest. Sarah couldn't walk quickly without her cane, and the smoke would be too thick for her weak lungs. Tears mixed with the soot on Chidinma's face. She thought about the times Sarah had given her a kind word when Bianca was being cruel. She thought about Sarah's fragile hands and her gentle smile. "I'm coming, Mama Sarah," Chidinma shouted, though her voice was lost in the noise of the burning wood. She didn't have a fire suit or a mask. She only had her light blue maid's uniform and the white apron tied around her waist. She ran to the garden hose, soaking her apron until it was heavy with cold water. She wrapped the wet cloth tightly around her nose and mouth. With one last look at the empty road where Bianca had fled, Chidinma turned toward the mansion. The main entrance was already a wall of orange fire. She had to find another way. She remembered the small servant's entrance near the kitchen. It was narrow and dangerous, but it was her only chance to reach the stairs. As the roof groaned and more wood crashed down, Chidinma didn't hesitate. She plunged into the swirling smoke, leaving the safety of the night behind for the hell waiting inside. The air inside the house was no longer air. It was a thick, gray soup of ash and heat that burned Chidinma's throat. She stayed low to the ground, crawling across the expensive marble floors that were now hot to the touch. Every time the house groaned, she felt a shiver of terror. Above her, the beautiful wooden beams that Charles Lewis had imported from Europe were snapping like dry twigs. She reached the west wing just as a section of the ceiling crashed down, blocking the main hallway. Chidinma didn't stop. She climbed over the burning piles of wood, her hands blistering as she gripped the heated edges of the debris. "Sarah!" she choked out, her voice raspy from the smoke. She finally reached the bedroom door and kicked it open. Sarah was huddled on the floor by the bed, her burgundy silk pajamas covered in soot. The elderly woman looked so small and fragile, like a bird with a broken wing. Her eyes were wide with a fear that broke Chidinma's heart. When Sarah saw the young woman in the blue uniform, she reached out a shaking hand. She didn't have her cane, and her legs were too weak to stand. "I've got you," Chidinma whispered, though she could barely breathe. She didn't try to help Sarah walk. There was no time for that. Instead, she knelt and pulled the older woman onto her back. Sarah was light, but as Chidinma stood up, the weight felt like the most important thing in the world. This wasn't just a person. It was the mother of the most powerful man in the city. It was the only person who had been kind to her. As they turned to leave, the ceiling above the bed gave way. A massive beam fell, grazing Chidinma's shoulder and pinning her against the wall for a second. The pain was sharp and hot, but she didn't let go. She braced her legs, her muscles screaming, and pushed forward. She shielded Sarah with her own body, taking the brunt of the falling sparks on her own back. They moved through the hallway as the world seemed to melt around them. Chidinma's lungs felt like they were on fire, and her vision was starting to go dark. But she felt Sarah's thin arms clinging to her neck, and she knew she couldn't fall. In that moment, the fire didn't just burn them, it changed them. The gap between the rich mother and the poor maid disappeared. They were just two souls trying to reach the light. When Chidinma finally burst through the back door and collapsed onto the cool, wet grass, she didn't let go of Sarah until she was sure the old woman was breathing the fresh night air. The roar of a high-powered engine broke the silence of the early morning. A black SUV flew up the driveway, throwing gravel into the air as it slammed to a halt. Charles Lewis jumped out before the car had even finished shaking. He was a giant of a man, with broad shoulders and a face that usually looked like it was carved out of stone. But as he looked at the glowing skeleton of his mansion, his eyes were filled with a terrible, dark fire. "Mother!" he roared, his voice shaking the trees. He didn't look at the firefighters or the broken glass. He only saw the ruins of the west wing where his mother slept. He grabbed a security guard by the shirt, his large hands trembling with rage. "Where is she? Where is my wife? Where is Sarah?" The guard pointed with a shaking finger toward the far side of the lawn, near the old oak tree. Charles ran, his expensive leather shoes treading over the wet grass. He expected to see his wife, Bianca, holding his mother. He expected to see his security team standing guard. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks, and the anger in his face turned into complete shock. There, sitting on the grass, was Chidinma. Her light blue maid's uniform was torn and black with soot. Her hair was messy, and her skin was covered in gray ash and red burns. She looked exhausted, her breath coming in heavy gasps, but she wasn't alone. She was wrapped around Sarah like a human shield. Sarah was leaning against Chidinma's chest, her silver hair resting on the maid's shoulder. Chidinma was rubbing the old woman's hand, whispering quiet words to keep her calm. "Charles," Sarah whispered, her voice weak. She looked up at her son, her eyes wet with tears. "She did it. She came back for me. Everyone else left, but she stayed." Charles knelt on the wet ground, his expensive suit getting ruined in the mud. But he didn't care. He looked at Chidinma, really looked at her, for the first time in the 3 years she had worked for him. He saw the burns on her arms. He saw the way she winced in pain but refused to move because she didn't want to disturb Sarah. He looked around for Bianca, but the driveway was empty. His wife's flashy car was nowhere to be found. The king of the city's underworld felt a strange tightness in his chest. He was used to people obeying him because they were afraid. He was used to people staying near him because of his money. But this girl, this quiet maid who he had looked past 1,000 times, had walked into hell for a woman who wasn't even her own blood. He reached out a large, steady hand and touched Chidinma's soot-covered shoulder. "You saved her," Charles said, his voice low and thick. Chidinma looked up at him, her dark brown eyes tired but brave. "She was alone, sir," she said simply. "I couldn't leave her." In that moment, the fire that had destroyed Charles's house started a different kind of fire in his heart, one that Bianca could never put out. The morning sun rose over the smoking ruins of the Lewis estate, but the light brought no peace. Charles stood in the middle of his private study, which was one of the few rooms the fire had not touched. He looked out the window at the empty spot in the driveway where Bianca's car used to be. His mother was safe in a private hospital, but his heart was heavy with a feeling he couldn't ignore. Something about the fire didn't feel like an accident. "Boss," a voice said from the doorway. It was Barrett, his most trusted security leader. Barrett looked tired, and his face was very serious. He held a small, clear bag in his hand. Inside the bag was a pink burner phone and a set of keys. "We found these in the bushes near the front gate. The phone was still logged into the mansion's security system." Charles took the bag, his large fingers tightening around it. He sat at his desk and began to look through the data on the phone. As he clicked through the messages, his face turned from pale to a deep, angry red. The phone belonged to Bianca. The messages showed that she had been talking to the Creed family, Charles's biggest rivals, for months. She hadn't just run away because she was scared. She had used her private code to turn off the sprinklers and the fire alarms. She had sent a message at 2 o'clock in the morning telling the rivals that the guards were changing shifts. In exchange, the Creeds had promised her $10 million and a safe place to stay once Charles was gone. She had traded his life, and the life of his mother, for a pile of money and a new start. "She left the door open for them," Charles whispered, his voice sounding like a low growl. He thought about Chidinma, who was at that moment resting in a guest room with bandages on her arms. He thought about how Chidinma had no money and no reason to stay, yet she had fought the flames. Then he thought about Bianca, who had every luxury in the world, yet had invited the fire into their home. Charles felt a coldness in his chest that was sharper than any knife. He had given Bianca everything she ever asked for. He had given her diamonds, silk, and a name that protected her. In return, she had tried to burn his world to the ground while he was away. He stood up, his broad shoulders blocking the sunlight. He didn't look like a husband anymore. He looked like a judge. He looked at Barrett and gave a short, hard nod. "Find her," Charles ordered. "She thinks she is safe with the Creeds, but she forgot one thing. Nobody betrays a Lewis and gets to keep the life they stole." Charles looked down at the pink phone one last time before crushing it in his hand. The search for his wife was over, but the hunt for the traitor had just begun. The rain started to fall as a silver SUV pulled into the driveway of the Lewis family's secondary estate. Bianca stepped out, looking as perfect as ever in a bright pink coat and high heels. She walked into the house with a sassy smile, acting as if she hadn't disappeared while the main mansion turned to ash. She found Charles standing in the large living room, his back to her, staring at the rain against the glass. "Charles, darling!" Bianca cried out, her voice sounding high and dramatic. She rushed toward him, her hands reaching for his shoulders. "It was so terrible. I was so scared that I just drove and drove until I found safety. I've been crying for hours thinking about you." Charles didn't move. He didn't turn around to look at her beautiful face or her perfectly styled hair. He only held up the plastic bag containing the pink burner phone. The room went very quiet. Bianca stopped walking, and for a second, her sassy expression wavered. She quickly tried to hide her shock behind a beautiful, sad pout. "Oh, that?" she whispered, her eyes filling with fake tears. "The rivals must have planted that to frame me, Charles. You know how much I love you. I'm your wife. I'm the woman who belongs by your side." She moved closer, trying to use her charm to soften his heart. She reached out to touch his chest, looking up at him with her big, expressive eyes. "Let's just forget this nightmare. We can take the insurance money and move to Paris. Just the two of us." Charles finally turned, and his gaze was so cold it made Bianca shiver. He didn't see a beautiful wife anymore. He saw a monster in silk. He thought of his mother, Sarah, who was still shaking in a hospital bed, and he thought of Chidinma, whose skin was blistered from saving a life Bianca had tried to end. "You didn't just run, Bianca," Charles said, his voice deep and dangerous. "You opened the door for the fire. You tried to kill my mother for a bank account." "Charles, please," she begged, falling to her knees and grabbing his hand. She tried to look small and helpless, using her beauty as a final weapon. "I was confused. I'll make it up to you. I promise." Charles pulled his hand away as if her touch was poison. He looked at Barrett, who stood by the door with 2 large guards. "Take her," Charles ordered. "Strip her of the Lewis name, take the car, the jewelry, and the phone. Leave her with nothing but the clothes she is wearing." Bianca's fake tears turned into a scream of rage as the guards grabbed her arms. She was dragged down the hallway and pushed out the front door into the cold, muddy rain. As the heavy doors clicked shut, Charles stood alone in the silence. He felt no sadness for the woman he had lost, only a growing respect for the quiet maid who was currently resting in the room next to his mother's. The trash had been cleared out, and for the first time, Charles could see who truly mattered. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beep of the machines keeping track of Sarah's heart. Sunlight streamed through the large window, landing on the bed where Sarah lay sleeping. Chidinma was sitting in a chair by the bed, her movements slow and careful. She was holding a cool cloth to Sarah's forehead, making sure the older woman didn't get too hot. Charles stood at the door, watching them. He had been standing there for 10 minutes, but Chidinma hadn't noticed him. She was too focused on his mother. He noticed that Chidinma was wearing a new dress, a soft, emerald green one that Sarah had asked the nurses to find for her. The color looked beautiful against her deep brown skin, but it couldn't hide everything. As Chidinma reached up to adjust the pillow, the sleeve of her dress slid down. Charles felt his breath catch in his throat. Across her arm and stretching toward her shoulder were thick red scars from the fire. They weren't pretty or smooth. They were jagged marks of pain, evidence of the moment the ceiling had crashed down on her while she shielded Sarah. Chidinma winced, a small flash of pain crossing her face as she moved, but she didn't stop her work. She simply bit her lip and continued to tuck the blanket around Sarah's feet. Charles stepped into the room, his heavy footsteps making Chidinma look up in surprise. She quickly tried to pull her sleeve back down, her face turning a little red. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, looking down at the floor. "I didn't hear you come in. I was just making sure she was comfortable." Charles walked closer until he was standing right in front of her. He didn't say anything at first. He gently reached out and took her hand, stopping her from hiding the scars. His large, calloused fingers were surprisingly soft as he touched the edge of the burned skin. "Don't hide them, Chidinma," Charles said, his voice lower and kinder than she had ever heard it. "They are ugly, sir," she replied softly, her eyes filling with tears. "I am just a maid, and now I am a maid with marks." Charles shook his head, his gaze steady and intense. "These aren't marks of a maid," he told her. These are the marks of a hero. My wife had perfectly smooth skin, but her heart was full of rot. You have these scars because you have the bravest soul I have ever met." For the first time, Chidinma didn't look away. She saw the truth in Charles's eyes. He wasn't looking at her like a servant anymore. He was looking at her with a deep respect and a warmth that made her heart race. He realized that while he had been looking for a queen in silk and diamonds, the real queen had been right in front of him all along, wearing a simple blue uniform and a heart made of gold. The peace of the safe house did not last long. In the middle of the night, the power suddenly cut out, plunging the rooms into a thick, heavy darkness. Chidinma sat up in her bed, her heart thumping like a drum. She didn't wait for a light. She knew the layout of the halls by heart now. She slipped out of her room and rushed into Sarah's bedroom just as the sound of breaking glass echoed from downstairs. "Chidinma, what is happening?" Sarah's voice was high and shaking with fear. "Stay quiet, Mama Sarah," Chidinma whispered, helping the old woman out of bed. "The bad men are back, but I won't let them touch you." She knew Charles was outside with Barrett, but the house was large and the attackers had come through the back garden. Chidinma led Sarah into the small walk-in closet and pushed a heavy wooden dresser in front of the door. Her breath was short, but her mind was clear. She remembered what Charles had told her about the safe house: never stop fighting. Suddenly, the bedroom door was kicked open. Chidinma stood in front of the closet, her back against the wood. Two men in black masks stepped into the room, their flashlights cutting through the dark. They didn't see a powerful mafia boss. They only saw a young woman in a green dress. "Move out of the way, girl," one man growled, raising a heavy metal pipe. "We just want the old lady. Move and you might live." Chidinma didn't move an inch. She grabbed a heavy glass lamp from the side table and held it like a weapon. Her arms, still covered in bandages from the fire, felt a sharp sting, but the pain only made her feel more determined. She thought of the fire. She thought of Bianca's betrayal. Most of all, she thought of Sarah's kindness. "You will have to go through me first," Chidinma said, her voice steady and loud. The first man lunged at her. Chidinma swung the lamp with all her strength, striking him across the arm. He cursed and tried to grab her, but Chidinma was faster. She used her smaller size to dodge his reach, pushing him back toward the door. The second man raised a gun, but before he could pull the trigger, the room exploded with light. Charles burst through the doorway like a storm. He didn't say a word. In a few quick moves, he disarmed the men and sent them crashing to the floor. Barrett and the guards followed close behind, securing the room in seconds. Charles didn't chase after the remaining attackers. Instead, he ran straight to Chidinma. He took her shaking hands in his, checking her for new wounds. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of worry. Chidinma took a shaky breath and nodded. "Sarah is safe. She is in the closet." Charles pulled her into a tight hug, his heart beating fast against hers. He realized then that Chidinma didn't need a gun or a title to be powerful. She was a shield that never broke. A few weeks later, the sun shone brightly on the newly repaired gardens of the Lewis estate. The smell of fresh grass and blooming flowers filled the air, replacing the old scent of smoke. Hundreds of people were gathered in the courtyard. These were not just any people. They were the leaders and families who worked with Charles. They stood in quiet rows, waiting to see why the boss had called them all together. Charles stood on the high balcony, looking down at the crowd. He looked strong and tall in his dark suit, but he wasn't alone. Standing right beside him was Chidinma. She wore a beautiful gown of deep gold that flowed to the floor. She looked like a queen, even though her hands were still covered in soft silk gloves to protect her healing scars. She felt nervous with so many eyes on her, but whenever she looked at Sarah, who was sitting nearby and smiling, Chidinma felt brave. Charles stepped forward and held up his hand. The crowd became perfectly still. "For a long time, I thought that power was built on fear and money," Charles said, his voice echoing across the garden. I thought a queen was someone who looked perfect and wore expensive things. But I was wrong. He turned to Chidinma and took her hand. A true queen is someone who stays when everyone else runs. A queen is someone who walks through fire to save the people she loves. She is the heart of this empire. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy box. Inside was a ring made of thick gold and a bright green emerald. It was the Lewis family ring, a piece of jewelry that had been passed down for many years. Charles slid the ring onto Chidinma's finger. It was a perfect fit. He leaned down and kissed her hand, showing everyone that she was no longer a maid, but the woman who would rule by his side. The silence of the crowd broke into a loud cheer. "Long live the Queen!" the guards shouted, and the sound carried all the way to the trees. Sarah stood up and hugged Chidinma, tears of joy in her eyes. Chidinma looked at Charles, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a shadow. She felt seen, she felt loved, and she finally felt like she was home. The invisible girl had become a hero, and the maid had become a wife. As the music started to play, Chidinma realized that the fire hadn't just destroyed a house, it had cleared the way for a brand new life.